Hello everyone, thanks for being with us today and thank you so much for investing your time with us. My name is 𝗕𝗵𝗵𝗴𝗁 and it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today. Well, I would like in a few seconds to welcome the speakers with us in this panel, and I will start by a small introduction related to this panel. Where Russia and Iran are collaborating more closely than ever in the eras of fighters, jets, and lethal drones. According to US intelligence, Moscow has rebuked Washington's assessment at the invasions of Ukrainian presses on the US President Biden administration has now embarked on a broad effort to halt Iran's ability to produce and deliver drones to Russia for use in the war in Ukraine. Well, an endeavor that has echoes of its yearly-long program to cut off Tehran's access to nuclear technologies. Today, we have an amazing panel. We will be tackling the changing bilateral rapports between Russia and Iran and what it means to the region and Lebanon. This panel is organized by 𝗕𝗵𝗵𝗴𝗁 Foundation, MCF Media Institute, in partnership with the Public Affairs section at the US Embassy in Beirut, and we will try to answer several questions. Well, I'll take a few moments to briefly introduce our panelists. We have Mrs. Hanin Ghaddar, Friedmann Fellow at the Washington Institute, a Geduld program on Arab politics. And hello Hanin, hope all is well. Also, we have His Excellency Mr. James Jeffrey, former ambassador to Iraq and Turkey and special envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS. And also, we have Mr. Alex Vatanka, director of the Iran program at the Middle East Institute. So, thanks again for being with us. As mentioned before, we will try to understand more what means on a geopolitical level and on a strategical level also, what are the impact of a changing bilateral report between Russia and Iran. We will start here, Your Excellencies, and we will start directly with you, Hanin, if you don't mind. How can we explain today the changing bilateral reports between Iran and Russia? How can you explain this?
Hello. Thank you very much for having me, and I hope that I'll be able to answer this question from my expertise, which is mostly Iran.
Sure. We will go also, we will speak with you also what is related to Lebanon, to region and Lebanon, but I'm starting with a general question.
Definitely. So I think, the Iranian-Russian coordination is not new. It has started in Syria, and we've seen a lot of back and forth coordination in Syria, and this has been an issue for the West in general, but particularly to the US and neighboring countries, of how Iran and the Russians are working together in Syria. There has been some kind of competition, but mostly coordination. The competition has been basically how to deal with sharing the resources and the power in Syria and who has the decision making. This relationship has definitely and obviously grown to military coordination in Ukraine when the Iranians started sending drones and military equipment. And we know that yesterday there was news about the Iranians launching a missile factory in Russia. And there are other news of more and more military coordination between the Iranian and Russians. That said, that we also have that during this time, while the Ukraine war was happening, the Iranian revolution started. Both events, the Iranian revolution and the Russian-Iranian coordination on military action in Ukraine have, I think, eliminated the confusion on how to deal with Iran. One, the whole negotiations over the nuclear program has halted, most probably stopped because of both events. But also now the question of how to deal with Iran, there is less confusion in the West, particularly in Europe, about how to deal with Iran. We know that there's a lot of talk today about whether the IRGC will be sanctioned on Europe or not, or in certain European countries. We know that the European stance on Iran has completely shifted. The confusion over how to deal with Iran in the Middle East, but also generally, has been shifting. So I guess there will be a lot more clearer and more robust policy more constructive policy and coordination between the U.S. and Israel on one hand on how to deal with Iran, and the U.S. and Europe also on how to deal with Iran. There will be less confusion. And to give you an example, last week there was this one of the biggest, if not the biggest, in very, very long time, military exercise between the U.S. and Israel on Iran. And this has not happened and was never going to happen if it was we still have this confusion. And there's also the question of how Israel is going to deal with Russia today. There's like a lot of talk about whether the Russians and Israelis are going to still be coordinating in many parts of the world, especially in the Middle East. So this is generally speaking about the coordination and its impact on Western policy and coordination. And definitely this will have some impact on Lebanon, but that's for different questions.
I'll go deep now with the impact on the region and Lebanon. But before, let me ask Mr. Alex, do you have something to add on what is related to the changing bilateral rapport or between Iran and Russia? Mr. Alex.
Sure. Thank you for having me. Look, Morris, I would say the following. I agree with pretty much everything that my friend Hanin just said in terms of describing the Russian-Iranian relationship in the region over the course of the last, certainly decade plus, certainly since the beginning of the civil war in Syria. I would just say on the point of where the United States is going vis-a-vis this new Russian-Iranian partnership, I agree again with Hanin that the Iranian decision to sort of support the Russian military campaign in Ukraine was very badly received in European capitals and in Washington. Iran, in my view, made a strategic error in siding with Russia when Iran didn't have to. This was not Iran's war. There are no national interests for Iran in this Russian invasion of a sovereign country, as is the case with Ukraine. But nonetheless, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the Iranian leader, decided to go with Vladimir Putin. This upset the West. This continues to upset the West. But I don't see this Western disappointment being the end of the nuclear diplomacy. I think for sure, for a brief few weeks and months since September, when the protests in Iran began and the Iranian regime began to kill its own citizens, the West really didn't know where to go. How can you negotiate with this regime when they are brutally killing their own people and supplying Russia with drones and maybe missiles? But as we have moved on, as you've heard from the highest European Union official, Josep Borrell, the Spanish diplomat, Europe is now going back and thinking, what is the alternative to diplomacy? I agree with Hanin that we've seen signals being sent from the US, from Israel. In recent weeks, you've had the attack on Iranian drone factory in Isfahan. You've had the largest ever CENTCOM military exercise with Israel that included about 10,000 troops from US and Israel. We've never seen anything like it before. This was a clear signal to the Islamic Republic. But these signals, I think right now, are meant to pressure the regime to come back to negotiations. I don't think these pressures are meant to be the beginning of a new chapter, which could be military conflict with Iran. I don't think Washington wants that. I don't think the Europeans want that. Yes, they're disappointed in Iran's close relations with Russia. They don't understand it. The West does not understand what Iran gets from this relationship, something I'm happy to talk about as we go through our conversation. But I don't think this Iranian-Russian new reality is necessarily the end of the nuclear talks between the West and the Iranian regime.
So Alex, do you think that does this Iranian relation between Russia and Iran signify a sustainable strategic alliance that will maybe reshape the geopolitics of the wider Middle East?
Right. Now, that's a great question. I'm not convinced. And I tell you why I'm not convinced. These are two very different political models. One is basically a Russian chauvinist nationalist entity by Vladimir Putin. It's an Orthodox Christian entity that believes in the glory of the past Russia. And then you have Ali Khamenei and the 𝗕𝗵𝗵𝗴𝗁 or the Revolutionary Guards, a theocracy, the concept of 𝗕𝗵𝗵𝗁, supreme leadership. These models are very difficult in terms of being compatible. You know, the last Russian ambassador who a few months ago left Iran, he was asked, Mr. Ambassador, why don't you invest more in Iran? Why don't Russians come to Iran? Why do they go to Dubai? Why do they invest in Istanbul and in buying property on the beaches of Turkey? You know, the Russian ambassador was saying in his answer, Iran is a difficult country for Russians to come to because you have a very strict Islamist political system. Our women have to put the hijab. The Russian men cannot drink their vodka. It's not a very attractive place. So my point is this. Yes, there will be some cooperation in the short term, but in the long term, we have to be aware that these are very different countries and very different political systems. They will have many issues to overcome before we can talk about a close partnership.
Let me hear also Hanin. Hanin, do you think this alliance will reshape the geopolitics of this wider Middle East, of all the region now? Or I mean here the new relation between Russia and Iran.
No, I agree definitely with Alex. It's very difficult to see this as a wider coordination. This is strategic military cooperation, right? So it started in Syria as strategic military cooperation. It's not an alliance. There's a difference between an alliance and strategic cooperation. And now in Ukraine, it's also a strategic military cooperation. There's a big question of why Iran would do that. In return, there must be something that the Russians are giving to Iran, maybe in Syria, maybe somewhere else, we don't know. But we do know that this is a strategic cooperation which is temporary, which is focused on one issue. And it's not necessarily going to change drastically the shape of their policy in the Middle East. And if you look at Syria today, for example, nothing really has changed except that the Russians pulled out a few of their troops, which was filled in by the Iranians, but nothing really has changed. If you look at Lebanon, if you look at the other parts of the region, it's strategic and it's temporary. And we know that eventually things are going to, what really is going to change things is not this coordination, but the change within the systems themselves, and mostly in Iran. If at one point Ali Khamenei dies, we know he's old, we know he's sick, he might survive a few more years, but at one point he's going to die, and the revolution is going to take definitely a different shape. And the newcomers, whether it's the IRGC or a different kind of regime, will shape this relationship and will shape the Middle East. This is the more important question about how the Middle East will be shaped, rather than a strategic, temporary military coordination. They need each other, but we also know that at some point, this conflict between the systems has manifested itself many times in Syria in terms of competition and clashes between the Russians and the Iranian proxies, where they were fighting over certain decisions and certain military points.
You mentioned that this relation will reshape after Ali Khamenei. So in which way?
So it depends who is going to, this revolution that we're seeing today, it fades.
What scenarios we have?
So there are many scenarios. It depends how the revolution is going to take shape, and it depends how the international community is going to deal with this opportunity of the supreme leader dying. This is a big opportunity because it will shape the next phase of the Iranians. There are scenarios of the IRGC taking over, and I think Alex is more of an expert on the internal Iranian politics in this sense. But what I see is three main scenarios, which is basically one, that the IRGC takes over and present themselves as the new supreme leader in one shape or another. Another thing is that the revolution takes place, and it's a chaos for a while, and we don't know what happens, because it's not a civil war because the protesters are not armed, but it's not clear, and we don't really have a successor, so it's going to take a while. Third scenario is more like peachy and ideal, where actually like a real regime change with a more democratic regime comes over, and this only happens if the international community has a unique, clear and coordinated policy on the next phase of Iran.
Do you have something to add, Alex? Because I would like to ask you another question, but before, do you have anything to add?
Sure. No, I agree with Hanin on the key issue of the fact that when Ali Khamenei dies, he's 83 years old. Khamenei has been the longest serving leader, arguably, in the world. He's been the supreme leader of Iran since June of 1989. He's been there over 3 decades now, and his death would be an important moment in the evolution of the Islamic Republic. Now, I don't know where the leaders, the second generation revolutionaries, will go. Frankly, I don't think anybody knows that. Iran has had, since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, Iran has had one change of supreme leadership in 1989 when Khomeini died and Khamenei took over. Back in 1989, nobody would have guessed that Ali Khamenei would become supreme leader. We might be equally surprised if there is another supreme leader, if the regime survives that long. But I don't know. But I do know when the basic
What
question...
if the regime survives?
What if they survive? What if that's a great question. If the regime does survive after Khamenei, again, the same issue is facing the regime. What do we do next? Do we look at our angry young people in our society in Iran and say we need to change policies? We need to change domestic policies. We need to change our regional policies, our American obsession with America. We need to focus on our economy. If this is what the IRGC decides to do, then really it becomes, IRGC meaning the Revolutionary Guards, then it becomes really difficult to see how close of a relationship Iran can have with Russia. And I'll tell you why. The simple reality is this. Iran's biggest problem today, in many ways, is the state of its economy. And there is not much Russia can do for the Iranian economy because they're both oil and gas producers and exporters. They're rivals. There's not much of a convergence. Iran needs to improve relations with the West in order to fix its economy. This is going to be very difficult for the Revolutionary Guards to accept because they've spent the last 44 years shouting slogans against the United States. It's going to be very difficult. But arguably, that's the quickest, safest way for them to survive as a political system because that's the only way they can fix the economy, which might, and this is a big if, turn some of those angry protesters to go home and be fixated on creating income for themselves as opposed to being in the streets.
Back to this tight relation between, or new relation between Russia and Iran. But don't you think that we're now at a high point experience in the relation between these two powers in which cooperation will always be limited by mutual distrust?
The history of Persia, Iran, Russia is one of mostly suspicion because the geography matters. 150, 200 years ago, the Russians took away all of Persian or Caucasus, the South Caucasus, countries like Georgia, Azerbaijan. So there's an Iranian narrative that looks at Russia with suspicion because the Russians have taken away more from Iran than have even ever contributed. So the suspicion is there. And I can tell you there's a lot of anger right now in Iranian society, including inside the Iranian regime, about some of the decisions, for example, provide drones to Russia. They're saying, the critics in Iran are saying, why are we doing this? This is not serving our national interest. But let me also say this. Ali Khamenei and Vladimir Putin have known each other for about a quarter of a century. Quarter of a century is a long time. They have known each other. They have invested in each other. They have a joint anti-American agenda. And this relationship makes perfect sense if you look at it from that prism. If you're both anti-American, if you are the most sanctioned country on earth, which is the case with Russia, and you are the second most sanctioned country on earth, which is the case with Iran, then there is a natural reason why you want to work together, to go around these sanctions, to undermine America in the Middle East. But if you're looking at it from a different prism, in terms of, okay, so you have an anti-American agenda. What else do you have? That's where you have a problem. What else does Iran, this theocracy, the 𝗵𝗵𝘁𝗵𝗶, have in common with Russia's Vladimir Putin? And that's where I don't see a convincing answer that leads me to think this is a tactical relationship. This cannot go on for a long time.
Hanin, are you still with us? You're here?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, okay. Hanin, back to the region. This tight relation, the bilateral relation between Iran and Russia today, Can we know more about the repercussions on the region of this growing relation between these two powers? It should have repercussions on the region in general. I mean here on the regional security. So, what do you think? What kind of repercussions?
So I'm thinking of three layers here when I think of the repercussions. One of them is obviously, and it has been going on since the Syria war and the revolution 2011, which is the cooperation on to protect Bashar al-Assad and protect both the Iranian and the Russian interests in Syria. This will continue, and I think this will also be fortified and maybe used as a bargaining chip between the Russians and the Iranians, in the sense if the Russians need more weapons from Iran or vice versa at one point, there will be more give and take in Russia, in Syria, I mean, in terms of contract, in terms of deal, in terms of oil, whatever it takes. So Russia and Iran will be negotiating over their shared interest, which is in the Middle East, is Syria, and they will be negotiating their strategic military cooperation over this particular shared interest. So this is one of the more practical repercussions, I think. And there might be also another way of doing this, in the sense that if the Russians need more troops to go to Ukraine, if the Russians need to focus more on Ukraine, this might give Iran a freer hand and more gaps to fill in Syria and the rest of the region, but mainly in Syria, because this is where Russia is. So this is definitely going to be one of the repercussions. Syria is definitely a theater to be watched during this period, to see how this coordination is going to affect the relationship and the Middle East. It's an example of how they are coordinating on the Middle East. Another thing is, I will go back to the Israel-Russia relationship. The pressure on Israel is very real now, in the sense of their relationship with Russia, which has been very valued in the Israeli military specifically, and the political circles, but mostly because of the Israeli operations in Syria and Russia giving them the free space to bomb Iranian, attack and target Iranian military positions in Syria. Israel wouldn't be able to do that if it wasn't for Russia's cooperation and intel as well. The Israelis need that, and they've always worked with the Russians on this. But today, with Ukraine and with the European and the American increasingly aggressive stance on Russia, the Israelis are under a lot more pressure to do something about Ukraine and do something about Russia and Ukraine. So this might have some repercussions either on the Israeli strikes on Syria, or on the general cooperation and diplomacy.
Alex, do you need to?
I still have one.
Yeah, please go ahead. I just wanted to ask also Alex about more repercussions. Maybe he would like to add. Please go ahead.
Just one last thing that might be a repercussion is mostly what I said at the beginning is the general effect of Europe on Iran.
Yes.
And basically how this coordination will make the European stance harsher on Iran, which means more sanctions.
Yeah,
and more,
that was my question. That was my question about the limitation and the European policy on Iran. But before, I would like to hear from Alex. Alex, any other maybe impacts of this relation on the region?
No, thank you, Morris. Look, I really struggle to see what else Iran and Russia right now or in the short term are going to do together elsewhere in the Middle East outside of Syria. And even in Syria, as Hanin pointed out, that has not been a trouble-free partnership. There are plenty of critics both in Russia and Iran that question the logic. And by the way, both Russia and Iran, let's just say for the sake of argument, they came to dominate Syria more so than they do today. What are they going to do with Syria? What are they going to do with a failed state, essentially, with massive, massive reconstruction need? Russia and Iran do not have the economic assets or even interest, maybe, to be involved. So I think in the short term, I'm speculating, but I think in the short term, what Russia can do for Iran in return for the drones, maybe missiles, ballistic missiles that Iran might provide, are are a continuation of Russian support, diplomatic cover in places like the United Nations, at the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, to protect a cover for Iran from Western criticism, because Russia oftentimes has a veto power. Russia can provide diplomatic cover, probably together with China. Outside of that, as I mentioned earlier, there is not a lot Russia can do for Iran's economy in the short term, because the Russians don't have the money, the capital. There are sanctions, so they can't bring technology and money immediately, which is what Iran desperately needs to fix its economy. So what can Russia do in the short term? I think one of the areas that I see an immediate area where Russia can do a lot more for the Iranians are things on the military front, in the sense that Iran needs to improve as much as it can things like its air defense systems for critical infrastructure assets, like its nuclear program and other issues inside of Iran that has already become a target for Israel. The Iranians are not convinced that Russia has been a good partner when it comes to supply of critical military, like air defense systems to Iran. The Iranians always suspect that the Russians have given him second or third rate weapons when they could have given him better. For example, they haven't given him the S-400 air defense system, only gave him very reluctantly the S-300 air defense system, which is not as good. So there are things Russia probably needs to do really to prove itself as a partner for Iran. Iran now has taken a major risk, embarrassed itself by giving these drones to Russia, and the Iranian public opinion and probably leaders will say, what are we getting in return from Russia? So that is now on Russia to deliver.
So, but Alex, what limitations does this set for European policy on Iran, or maybe also the wider MENA region or Russia?
The immediate area where you see this Iranian-Russian partnership complicating the European agenda when it comes to Iran is that it's already has slowed to the point of almost bringing the nuclear talks to an end. But as I said before, they haven't come entirely to an end. We just had allegedly a message from Washington through the Qataris to Iran about an interest to revive the talks. It's the Iranian side, to this day, refusing to have direct talks with Washington. Washington wants to talk to Iran directly about the nuclear program, and I'm sure Iran's regional agenda. It's Iran that's refusing to talk to the Americans. And you know what? I suspect if Vladimir Putin had a say, he would tell Ali Khamenei, don't talk to the Americans directly, because it perfectly suits Russia's interest that Iran and United States remain enemies. This is a beautiful situation from Russia's perspective.
Hanin, I would love to hear your point of view related to the European side. So you've mentioned before what is related to the European side and the impact of this changing bilateral relation between Russia and Iran.
Yeah, you can see many signs of this, right? The whole debate about the sanctioning RGC, the little shifts that you see here and there, but like the European stance on the Europeans finally realized with the Ukraine war that they are no longer safe. They have thought since World War II that Europe is safe, that Europe is not going to go through war again, and no one will dare do this. And then Putin comes in and says, well, I can invade a European country and you can't do anything about it. And then the Europeans had a shock, political shock, and they realized that they're not safe anymore. And another shock that they have is when the Iranians started sending drones to Russia and Ukraine and this military coordination. This was a huge shock for them, because the Europeans have always thought that at one point, if they play nice with Iran and if they really do the diplomatic game with Iran in the region and in Europe and no sanctions and the whole thing with the negotiations, they would be safe from Iranian aggression and they would be safe from Iranian backlash. But that was shocking in the sense that everything they've done so far, Europe finally realized that the Iranians are going to side with their enemies at their doors. So for the Europeans, that was a huge shock, which led to a real awakening in the sense of that who the real enemy is and who is the ally. Alliance between Europeans and the Iranians will never happen. A coordination and trust that they were hoping for during the negotiations over the nuclear program is not going to happen. The Europeans realized that this diplomacy is a failed game, and at the end, the Iranians are going to help the invader in Europe. So this has caused a real shift in the European stance on Iran, and there are many signs that we're seeing. If you go back to Lebanon, you'll see that we haven't seen serious action yet, but the shift is happening based on many statements and by officials in Europeans. The judicial delegation that came to Lebanon a couple of weeks ago to look into the 𝗕𝗵𝗵𝗴𝗏 files and the investigation of the port explosion from France, Germany, and Luxembourg. That was a big sign, I think, in the sense that where the Europeans
on this point, what's next, do you think? I wanted to pass directly to do the impact on Lebanon, but I wanted to pass before by the region. But you've mentioned the file, or the legal file now, and the new European investigations in Lebanon. So what's next, Hanin? What do you think? What is related to this issue?
I think the Europeans are very slow. We have seen that many times, that they are extremely slow in terms of taking steps. So I think at one point, they might seriously start considering sanctions. During our talks with European officials here in DC, this issue has been raised many times, and you can sense there's a different stance on sanctions.
Sanctions on politicians, bankers,
sanctions on everyone that is hampering judicial, the justice and reforms.
But so sanctions based on what?
Based off so for example, like this follow-up with the 𝗥𝗽𝗽𝗏 and the investigation into the explosion, right? So whoever today is hampering justice, there might be, I'm not saying there will be, but there is talk about sanctioning people who are standing in the way of justice. There are talk of, like at the
but
end
this
of the day,
can be applied also on the central bank?
Yes, of course. Like everyone who is, like, they're looking into this not because they're interested and they are curious. They're looking into this for policy implications. They're not looking into this only in order to, pressure. The Europeans have this strategy of giving time for people to correct their mistakes before they do sanctions. Sanctions for the Europeans is the last resort, right? Every time you talk to a European official and ask them about sanctions, they tell you that they have already done the framework is ready. And there are a lot of discussions in Europe and contradictions, but at the end of the day, they all agree on one thing, that sanctions is the last resort, not the first resort. It's different from the American policy. American policy, sanctions is a tool. For the Europeans, sanctions is the last resort. So I think they are reaching they're reaching a point in Europe where this is the end of it. This is the last resort. And the Lebanese have made it very clear that they're not going to do anything. The Iranians are helping their enemy in Europe.
But Hanin, we tried the sanctions with Iran. We tried the sanctions before with many members here of the Hezbollah and others. But do you think the sanctions strategy can take us to positive results?
It depends. It depends how it's done. Like sanctions in general, it's not like sanctions is a tool, it's not a policy. To start with this, right? If sanctions is a part of a real, coherent and credible policy, yes, they can have great results. But if sanctions are used as a policy by themselves, no, of course not. And sanctions, and also, like when you think about sanctions in Lebanon, there are no sanctions on Lebanon the way it is on the regime in Syria. There are no sanctions on the Lebanese state. There are sanctions against individuals. And when you sanction individuals, you're not actually targeting the people. You're targeting this specific individual. So yes, in that case, it yielded results because these individuals are made an example of. So when 𝗕𝗵𝗵𝗏 was sanctioned, he was sanctioned, not the Lebanese or the Christians were sanctioned. He specifically was sanctioned. And now we know that if the Europeans sanction him as well, he will be very limited. The guy is today radioactive. He's everywhere he goes. He's poisonous. So people don't want to be near him. His business community don't want to be part of it. So this, yes, of course, it's obvious that individual sanctions always work. Sanctioning against Hezbollah is less effective because Hezbollah's economy is cash economy.
The parallel economy and the black economy and He has his financial institutions, so...
Exactly. So it's more of a messaging, and basically the sanctions against Hezbollah is more to target Hezbollah's business community in Africa and in Europe, etc. So people who work financially with Hezbollah will be worried about these sanctions more than Hezbollah themselves. But sanctions against other Lebanese, like the people like the 𝗵𝗵𝘁𝗵𝗶 or the those who are standing in the way of reforms and investigation of the port explosions, going after individuals is not going to harm the people. It's just, you know, making sure that there is a punitive measure for people who are refusing to reform the country and moving forward with this and getting out of the crisis. So yes, it depends. The sanctions in general is not a policy. It has to be part of a bigger policy where we know where we're going, and that's not always the case. That's the problem.
Let me go back to Alex. Alex, I'll go back to the impact of this new relation between Russia and Iran on the region. So, because I would love to hear also Hanin, what if Hezbollah will get involved there. But before this, Alex, what is the impact of this tight new relation between Russia and Iran for the region and on the region?
No, as we described it in the earlier round, I think, you know, it's right now not, to best of my knowledge, having a immediate impact anywhere as such. I mean, if you look at the Yemen conflict, if you look at the situation in Syria, the situation in Lebanon, in North Africa, where Iran frankly isn't present. Iran is not, for example, a player in the Libyan conflict. Russia has not changed its position on Israel. You know, Russia remains, or Vladimir Putin for sure remains close to Benjamin Netanyahu. So I'm not sure whether I can say to you right now, the last few months or even the last few years of closer Russian-Iranian relations is having a shift, an impact in this particular zone in the Middle East or not. It might be happening behind the scenes. I doubt it. I think it's actually what it is. It's what we see. Khamenei and Putin share this animosity for different reasons towards the United States. What they call this, they call the United States this sort of hegemonic bullying power. It's the language both of them use. They come from different political backgrounds, but they use the same language almost when. And there will be coordination. For example, you know, Russia Today and Iran's Press TV will learn from each other's operations. They'll feed up each other and so on. There'll be some cooperation, as we've already seen in the military field. But then there are the structural limitations, and the key structural limitations that will limit relationship, economic relationship that cannot really go much further than it is today.
But Alex, today Iran is delivering drones to Russia to be used in the Ukrainian war. Do you think this will push the U.S. administration to say bye-bye for the nuclear deal for years now, until we see how the Ukrainian war will end?
Not necessarily. I don't think that alone. I mean, look, the Americans and the West in general have had to deal with this nuclear program of Iran going back to year 2002. This is over 20 years old. If there was a quick solution to this, it would have been taken care of a long time ago. So the fact that we're still having a diplomatic track is because there aren't very good alternatives. You know, the United States wishes that the regime in Tehran would focus more on delivering for its people. Where is the Iranian foreign minister the last few days? He is in Latin America. He's in Venezuela. He's in Cuba. What economic interest does Iran have in Latin America? Not very little. Why is Iranian Foreign Minister 𝗕𝗵𝗵 in the Caribbean? Well, because that's the only place where he has found some fellow anti-American figures that they can sit down and have a photo opportunity so they can say to the people of Iran, we're not alone. But in fact Iran is alone. And if you want to know why
so
Iran
here's
is
the
alone,
interest of Iran to go and sign the deal.
I'm sorry?
So here's the interest of Iran to go and sign the deal.
Oh, if Iran was serving its own national interest, it would have signed a nuclear deal a long time ago, I think. But I don't think the Iranian regime is putting Iran's national interest ahead. I think what they're putting ahead is Khamenei's narrow interest and the interest of the Revolutionary Guards. That's my view. Others obviously might disagree with that. But I think, this Iranian nuclear program has cost Iran dearly for over 20 years. And it could have been handled very differently if the political leadership in Tehran had, at some point over the last 20 years, opted to go in a different direction than the one they chose to be on, of confronting, of intransigence, and not wanting to compromise with the West, and instead putting their eggs in the basket of Vladimir Putin. And again, for the life of me, I don't know what they're hoping to get out of it for their economy, because there's not a lot Russia can deliver for Iran right now on the economic front.
So let me welcome His Excellency Mr. James Jeffrey, former ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, and special envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS. Mr. James, you're with us now. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Sorry to be so late.
No worry at all. Thanks for your time, and thanks for being with us.
Call. So how can I help you today?
So we'll have like few minutes with you. We'll ask you some questions related to the topic of this panel. So can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Thank you so much. So the title of this panel is related to the bilateral changes, or the changing bilateral relation between Russia and Iran, and the impact of this new relation on the region. How can you explain this new tight relation between Russia and Iran? And we saw this also by the support of Iran for the Russian troops in the Ukrainian war.
There's nothing surprising about this. You have to start with the basics, the realities of international relations, realities that we have a hard time here in Washington understanding, and frankly, people in the Middle East, for ideological, anti-colonialist, left and right-wing reasons, don't get either. The United States has been running a global collective security system, which has been complemented by and augments a global international trade, financial, cultural value system as well since 1945, almost 80 years. What we're seeing is those countries that want to challenge this system and return to a 19th century great and middle great powers situation. China is one of them, Russia is one of them, North Korea is one of them, Iran is one of them. Other countries may take various positions, but be they India or South Africa or Israel or Turkey or Argentina, they're both beneficiaries of this system, and they're not really trying to challenge it, although they may or may not be contributing very much to it. But that's different than what we have with Iran and Russia. They are both sharing the same goal, which is to overthrow this security system, in the case of Russia, internationally, in the case of Iran, in the Middle East.
But don't you think the Russian-Iranian relation signify a sustainable strategic alliance that will in some way reshape the geopolitics of all the Middle East?
I think that is their goal. However, having dealt for years with the Russians on Syria, there are, even though they share the basic bottom line goal of overthrowing that system, they have different priorities. Iran, of course, is a bitter enemy, or claims to be a bitter enemy of Israel, whereas Russia has good relations with Israel. And you have the same issues between China and Russia. So that you can't predict necessarily how they will work with each other in a given situation. What you can, however, be sure of is that neither of them are going to try to help the United States against the other.
What about the repercussions on the region, or regional repercussions for this the bilateral relation today between Russia and Iran?
Well, it's interesting.
If I might add, it's about the regional security. This is
right.
my point.
Iran is threatening regional security by undermining, I want to underline, undermining the sovereignty of numerous Arab states. We can begin right there in Lebanon. We can add Syria. We can add Iraq. We can add Yemen. And it would like to do that in more places as well. that is a regional security threat. It's in all elements of government. They use terror, they use subversion, they use political manipulation, they use bribes, they use oil and gas sales, and of course they use the potential of a nuclear weapon, all in various ways to advance their agenda. I don't think they're going to be successful in the region because they're not that strong, and most of the region is allied against them. But absent a more clear-cut, stronger American policy of contesting Iran in these places, you're not going to see much change in either direction. Russia is different. Russia does not have much power in the Middle East. It has, of course, an OPEC plus relationship with the Saudis and other oil-producing states. It has a minor presence in Libya that was battered by the Turks several years ago. And, of course, it has its main position in Syria. That's not enough to really give Russia the ability, as it did during the Cold War until 1973, to challenge the United States in the region. But we have to watch it out. We have to watch out for what Russia does.
So what about the impact on the European policy?
European policy?
Yeah, in general. So what's happening today between Russia and Iran, and how the European will take this relation, how they will react to this
Wait. I spent a lot of time trying to figure what the European policy is towards the European crisis in the Ukraine without a whole lot of success. If anybody on the panel can help me or has a friend who can help me, please let me know. The idea of the Europeans actually figuring out what to do in the Middle East, it won't happen. It has never happened. They have no policy. They have specific interests and hobby horses and minor things they do, minor issues they pursue. Obviously, they have important trade relations, including energy imports. But beyond that, zero, nada, nothing.
So thank you, Mr. James. We'll go directly to Mrs. Hanin Ghaddar. Hanin, you still with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Hanin, I would like to go deeper in the impact on Lebanon. What if the Hezbollah get involved?
Get involved in what?
In this tight new relation between Iran and Russia, in a way, in Ukraine maybe, and somewhere.
They've already involved. Hezbollah is already involved in this relationship in Syria. So everything that Iran, the coordination between Iran and Russia and Syria is trickled down to the coordination between.
What if we will see an extent to the Ukrainian war?
Hezbollah going to Ukraine? You mean?
I don't know. Maybe.
No. This is not something that Hezbollah would want to do or the Iranians would want to do. This is not. I don't think that we are at a point where the Russians are going to ask their partners to send in troops, and I don't think they would want to do that. This is not. They're not allies in the sense that the Iranians can ask Lebanese Hezbollah to go to Syria. The Russians cannot ask Iranians to send their proxies.
So what bill Hezbollah is pushing the Lebanese today to pay, but while involving himself in this issue, in this.
Again, Hezbollah's involvement with Russia is Iran's involvement with Russia.
Yes.
That's pretty right.
Yes.
So as long as Iran and Russia coordinates in Syria, Hezbollah will have to be part of this policy. So I'll give you an example. Today, if the Iranians realize that the Russians have left some gaps in Syria because they needed more troops in Ukraine, who is going to fill these two positions? Hezbollah and other proxies. So this is part of where Hezbollah fits in. At one point, if you see that the Iranians have to send more weapons to Russia and Ukraine, and the Iranians have started to, asking some of these facilities in Syria that have been built by the Iranians to produce weapons, they might do similar things. Like in Russia yesterday, they started a facility, right? Yes. So some of these facilities that they might be building in Russia, according to the news, we don't know how accurate this is. If some of these facilities being built in Russia today to produce weapons, Hezbollah might be involved in one way or another because they're Iran's most important army, most experienced and most significant weapons experts. So this is the extent of this involvement. I don't think there will be more. In Lebanon, per se, Another repercussions, I'm saying, if the relationship between Israel and Russia changes, it will be impacted in Syria, and Hezbollah's targeting of Iran's facilities and Hezbollah's facilities in Syria might be affected. But this is too early to say,
Yes.
and this is something that
I would like to hear Mr. James Jeffrey also answer to this question. We're here in Lebanon, so we'd love to hear any signs of any impact of maybe new relations between big powers around the world. So what could be maybe this the impact of this changing relation between Russia and Iran on Lebanon?
That's a good question. It's very hard because the position of the United States on Iran in the region is a mystery. The United States had a position on Iran concerning getting back into the 𝗕𝗵𝗴𝗏. We know that that is frozen. The United States military, the Central Command, has a military posture of helping allies defend against Iran. It's very active right now, in fact. But there is no overarching policy to contest Iran in the region. We had one in the Trump administration. We had one in the Bush administration. We did not have one, of course, in the Obama administration because he relied on the 𝗕𝗵𝗴𝗏. The Biden administration seems to rely on nothing. If you do not have an overarching policy, then you cannot come up with a specific policy on Lebanon or on Syria or on Yemen. You basically deal with specific problems, a humanitarian issue in Lebanon, a humanitarian issue in Syria or Yemen, the issue of the offshore gas in Lebanon and Israel, the issue of arming the Lebanese army to help it fight terrorism and supposedly be an alleged balance against Hezbollah. But these are all minor U.S. actions that don't have any central thought to them. If you want to see central thought, whether you agree with it or not, look at how the United States is approaching Ukraine right now. Mm-hmm. Everything it's doing is coordinated, has an overall arching goal. It's very clear, it's communicated, and they use very powerful steps to do it. If you see anything like this in the Middle East involving the United States and Iran, please tell me. And thus, we're not doing anything specifically in Lebanon. I couldn't even tell you if we really want to see Hezbollah's influence reduced in Lebanon. We consider it a terrorist organization because to make our Israeli friends happy and because Hezbollah has attacked us many times as well. But the point is, we don't really have a vision for Lebanon independent of specific things. We support free elections, even if they don't produce anything and all of that. I mean, I don't want to be cynical here, but I've seen, even under the Trump administration, our weakest area in contesting Iran was in Lebanon because there are too many other interests. People are, it is such a lovable country here in Washington. People want to take care of the humanitarian situation. They want to support the army. They want to support Resolution 1701 and the useless UN peacekeeping force in the South and on and on and on. They want to do the gas deal, but they don't really have a vision for how it's clear. And I think to the Lebanese who are on this panel or are watching, it's clear that you can't fix Lebanon without, among other things, fixing Hezbollah's chokehold on the country. We have not only do we not have a policy to deal with that, we don't even have a specific policy of stating that, what I just said.
Yes. So we're getting close to the end of our time together. If there's anything you would like to add to our audience or any recommendation, what would it be? I will start with Mr. Alex. So any recommendation, anything to add to this panel?
No, look, I mean, in terms of what Western policy should be, I agree with Ambassador Jeffries. I mean, look, the United States doesn't really have a policy towards what to do with the Islamic Republic. We're kind of in a limbo. I mean, it's been so much focus on the nuclear issue. I mean, the last few weeks and months, the protest movement in Iran, which, could have been the beginning of a revolution and might be a revolution, because I certainly wouldn't dismiss it. I don't think it's dead. I think that Iranian angry public opinion is not going to go anywhere. But that might become a moment for the United States to come up with a long-term policy post-Khamenei, post even Islamic Republic, where you focus on the Iranian people, which, about 85% of them are against the Islamist regime of Khamenei. How do you invest in them? How do you support them? But, I'm not convinced that Washington has a game plan for that. I don't see it. I think the discussion is happening, but I don't think it's a priority. Obviously, Ukraine and U.S.-China relations have taken so much of the time of the Biden administration. But to have a policy for United States that looks at Iran, as obviously the country of Iran under Ali Khamenei, as a challenge that, if confronted effectively, systematically, in a way, for example, U.S. has acted in the last year in Ukraine, that if you could bring about a change, political change in that country, not through an invasion or anything like that, but by supporting the Iranian people in ways to, essentially free themselves from a system that the majority of them do not want to live under. If you bring that outcome about, and I know it's not an easy thing, but you have to be hopeful and creative and optimistic here. If you can do that, the ramifications for the Middle East would be great. It won't be limited just to Iran. Iran, last time Iran had a revolution in 1979, it had an impact across the Middle East. The same thing would happen if Iran changed course and went in a different direction. You have a very different relationship, for example, with your country of Lebanon. And would have to look at Russia as a neighbor that you have relations with, you trade with, but that Russia, certainly not Vladimir Putin, is no magic bullet to fix Iran's problems. That's where you want to hope the United States could go. But as I said, that's a hope. Washington might choose this path going forward, but we don't know if that's going to happen.
So, Hanin, I'll take your
Just very quickly, I think there are two things that are very important. On the broader issue is, I think the United States and Europe, especially the United States since we're here, needs to start looking at the region the way Iran looks at the region. Not compartmentalize it the same, like Lebanon policy, Syria policy, Iraq policy, because one, there's no enough bandwidth and focus in Washington on these countries, on the Middle East. When you compartmentalize it and divide these countries, you lose a lot of time and focus. And Iran doesn't see it that way. In order to counter Iran in the region, you have to counter it the way it is present in the region, by having an Iran regional policy. Simple. Lebanon, with Hezbollah, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, all of these countries are dominated by one Iranian policy, and the U.S. should have a very similar approach to the region and look at these countries as having one big problem that has very similar consequences, which is corruption. But the problem is Iran's domination. And when you have this policy, it would be very much easier to see things clearly. Another thing, which is more on details, I'll just give you some examples. Sometimes it doesn't take much time to have impactful and actionable policy. Not a lot of time. It doesn't need a lot of time to go after those in Lebanon, for example, who are hindering justice. It's great to hear statements saying that the investigation on Luqman Slim's killing and assassination is important and we need to know more and the Lebanese government has to do more. And it's great to hear statements saying that the court investigation is essential and the thought has to be supported. But what are we doing about this? Why aren't those in charge of or standing in the way of justice accountability in Lebanon, which I think justice and accountability, the judicial system and accountability in Lebanon is key today in order to counter all these assassinations and political assassinations and corruption? Why none of these? Why is not 𝗥𝗽𝗽 getting sanctioned? 𝗥𝗽𝗽 has to be sanctioned today, yesterday, not tomorrow. There are a lot of things that don't need much and need to be, I'm not saying that the sanctions that are happening are not important. The guy 𝗥𝗽𝗽, who was sanctioned last year, was a great statement against the central bank and the Hezbollah corruption. But there are other issues that are more sensitive that can be done. A lot can be done in order to hold accountability in Lebanon in higher regard. That's just my
Thank you, Hanin.
opinion. I can talk about this for hours.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot, Hanin. Your Excellency, Mr. Ambassador, James Jeffrey, end this panel with you. You're still with us? I can't see Mr. James.
I'm here.
You're here, okay. I can't see you, so that's why. I would love to hear your recommendations at the end of this panel.
Sure. One, the United States needs to have an announced, carefully thought out policy to contest Iran in the region. As my friend Hannah said, this has to be a comprehensive region-wide policy. But I want to give you a taste of what this means. It's fun to say, that's what we do here at the Washington Institute where I used to be, or at the Wilson Center where I am now. Oh, we need a new policy, da-da-da. But what does that mean? Well, I'll tell you what it means, because I saw it in action and contesting Iran in Iraq in 2020. It means telling the Iraqi government, here are 6 things Iran and its political parties that are beholden to Iran, and these illicit militias that answer to Tehran, not through Baghdad, are doing, that are undercutting your sovereignty and undermining your economy and your political system. Now, you fix these 6 things. You can't change everything. You can't purge the country of Iran. We know this. But for a start, you fix these 6 things, or no assistance from the United States, no more weapons sales, no more help in the IMF, no more work with the Arab states to bring you into the fold. We're going to be your best friend or your worst enemy. So what do you say? And the Iraqis thought about that, where they came up with a new prime minister, 𝗕𝗵𝗵, who was actually quite good. He's just been replaced by al-Sudani, who I think in the end will turn out to be less good because he's more under the control of the Iranians. And, of course, they basically rolled back a lot of the Iranian hold on the green zone on the airport and other things. Rather, what some of you will remember Mr. Hariri tried to do, I think it was in 2008 in Lebanon, not encouraged by the United States, but it was right, and what he got was a Hezbollah military operation. So we pushed back. What we got was Iranian shellings, but we lived through that, and we basically got some progress. But that's tough. That means making that a priority. That means hurting the country, the people who are dependent upon this outside assistance in order to push back the Iranians. That's not an easy decision. I think it's the right decision, but it's a very consequential one, and it would have to be applied in Lebanon as well.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Mr. James Jeffrey, Mrs. Hanin Ghaddar, and Mr. 𝗥𝗽𝗽𝗁𝗏. Thank you so much. We really do appreciate your interest in this very important issue and this very fruitful panel we had. Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much. Good to see everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
إلى اللقاء.